Welcome back to the Shelf Destruct podcast. Boys, it's so great to see you again. For anyone tuning in for the first time, this is a continuation of Albert Camus The Stranger. We're about to dive into part 2. If you haven't listened to our episode on part 1, you can check it out in the description below. But yeah, great to see you, boys. Jensen, do you want to give a quick recap of part 1 just to kind of get everyone back up to speed?
For sure. So we start with one of the most famous opening lines of literature, with the main character, Merusault, telling about how he heard of his mother's death. She had been placed in a home because he couldn't afford to have her live in his house. And he's talking to, after he finds out, he talks to his boss about needing time off to go bury his mother. And we see him kind of listlessly drift down, tired and anxious, and attend the wake and then eventually bury his mother. And it seems like he's very much disconnected from the death of his mother, and really even had a very disconnected relationship to her in general while she was alive. The day after he returns home from burying his mother, he wakes up and decides he wants to go for a swim and runs into a girl that he used to work with in his office, and they end up hitting it off and go to the movies, and then she goes back home. So we see him kind of just living this life as if nothing mattered, prior to what has happened with his mother's passing. We also have a line that stood out to me in the book where the female interest for him, Marie, she asks if he loves her, and he says, "It doesn't matter, but probably not." So we kind of start to see a bit of this guy's character, and we see him interact with the neighbors in his apartment building, and he ends up befriending this guy that, correct me if I'm wrong, he's like a night watchman or a guard at like a factory or something. And we start to get to know this guy as Merusault begins to spend time with him, and he's kind of a dude, and beats on his girlfriend because he thinks that she's cheated. And eventually the police get called, and Merusault backs up his neighbor's story. The neighbor's name is Raymond, by the way. And then Marie, Merusault, and Raymond decide to go to the beach. And while they're there, they run into the girl, that girlfriend's brother and his friends. And in the book, he refers to them as Arabs. As a reminder, this story is set in French Algeria, French Algiers. And a brawl ensues where Raymond begins to beat up on the girlfriend's brother. And while he is distracted, he gets slashed by the Arab, and they have to help him back to the beach house to get bandaged up. And our main character, Merusault, decides that he just can't possibly deal with walking back up the steps to the beach house, so he decides to walk back down the beach, and describes this scene of feeling the sun bearing down on him and it becoming oppressive. And he rounds kind of this corner on the beach to this little cove and comes upon the brother laying there. And the brother pulls out a knife and starts to stand up and back away. And Merusault has a gun in his pocket, pulls it out, and murders the guy. So that's where we are from part 1. Taylor, where do we go from here?
Thanks, Jensen, for that recap. So, like he just mentioned, the part 1 culminates in a very absurd murder. We're not really given a whole lot of reason as to why Merusault carries out that act. And part 2 opens with him in jail. He's been arrested for this killing, and that's kind of where we pick up. He's been arrested. He's going to be on trial for murder, and we're going to figure out how he's going to defend himself. One could, at this point, kind of assume that there's a case to be made that this was a self-defense killing. as the Arab does brandish a knife at him and had already slashed Raymond with the knife, so there was kind of a probable cause of violence could have possibly ensued. But the whole thing kind of feels very otherworldly and absurd, for lack of a better word. This is the word that Camus keeps coming back to, is that it's none of this really makes a whole lot of sense in the way that we think about how cause and effect works. Okay. So I know that some of us have read this before, and I know Will hasn't read part 2 before. So I'd love to kick it over to you to get your first initial impressions with kind of this beginning part of part 2. Like, how did it make you feel?
For sure. So, I mean, if you're looking back at things I said in the first episode about just his perspective on all this, it's how frustrating it was for me to read some of these passages. I mean, and even it was the same way for the characters that Merusault interacted with. They felt that same frustration. The lawyer was asking for some commentary that he could build a case around, and kept finding, basically a brick wall when it came to, building his case. Merusault, just really couldn't give him anything that he could hold on to. I think one that's kind of shown more and illustrated pretty clearly when, he's talking about his mother's passing, and, he's like almost embarrassed that he has to ask him, like, did you care? Like, you smoked next and, and had coffee next to her coffin.
You didn't even want to see the body,
Yeah.
That's brought back up.
Mm-hmm. So, like, I really also found myself relating to all those characters who are interacting with Merusault, because they were seeing and experiencing just basically the fullness of a person who sees the world in an absurdist light. And, these 62 pages, really, really interesting, I guess, first pass for me as a first-time reader.
I find it interesting that you really felt aligned with the people questioning Merusault. And this is my second time reading it, and like the first time reading, I don't think I grasped fully I didn't grasp nearly as much as I did this time. But like out of context, a lot of these things, I think could look benign on the surface if you take them piecemeal, and isolated. Like, we talk about, going all the way back to the very beginning where he goes to his mother's wake, and he's exhausted. He's been up all day traveling on, by bus. It's hot. And he finally gets there. The lights inside of the chapel are extremely bright, and he's dozing asleep, and the caretaker comes in and offers him coffee. And like, I know that, like, I don't know. I think that last time I talked to somebody about this book is like there's some amount of like cultural taboo of like eating or drinking at a wake, and like me, like being separated, I can understand that, but like me being separated from that culturally, like I in my mind when I was reading, I was like, can't someone like be thirsty and like want coffee, especially as tired as he is? Like, coffee has caffeine, and we think about like when this book was written, everybody smoked, and they smoked everywhere. So like those things don't seem so egregious to me. And then him falling asleep at the wake. I mean, you look at how exhausted he was. And then they question whether or not he cried, and like, is a son not allowed to be in shock after his mother dies suddenly? So like, if you look at what happens in those scenes on its face, whenever I'm reading the second part, whenever they're questioning him about this, I'm like, what? One, why does that matter? How does that relate to the murder? Two, why are these things so egregious that they are need to be explained away for the defense, or why are they like crucial evidence for the prosecution?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you've hit upon a really, really interesting point, and I think it's worth kind of referring back to Camus' almost like thesis statement for this book. I did mention this on the previous episode, but I'll just go ahead and quote it again. To paraphrase, he says that he had this feeling that basically the world would have no place for someone who doesn't cry at their mother's funeral. And then he says the hero is condemned because he doesn't play the game. So what you're getting at is correct in a way, right? Like he's doing all the things that one could be justified in doing, being in shock. Like it's something that comes up a little bit later, and we'll talk about this more as we talk about the trial, is some of the incriminating evidence against him is that, the day after the funeral, he hooks up with a girl that he knew. And it's almost like, well, is it really society's place to tell people the correct way to grieve? And in a way, it kind of is. And that's sort of the point, is that if you exist outside of the social structures and the societal expectations of your time, you will always be kind of
a stranger, per se.
Perfect. Perfect.
Dun, dun.
But that's exactly right. And that's exactly what Camus himself says. I quoted this from The Myth of Sisyphus again last episode, but he says, in a universe that's suddenly deprived of illusions and enlightenment, man feels himself a stranger. So a lot of these illusions are what you're talking about. The social strictures of polite society, how one should behave in the face of grief, or in in other characters' particularities, like the way that they react to things seems to comport more or less with how one should behave. And he also, as Camus says, he refuses to lie. And again, I'll underscore that he says that lying is not only saying what's not true, but it's especially saying more than is true. So with all of that in mind, you're getting at the exact essence of kind of what Camus is talking about here, that in the face of the absurdity of the universe, if you were to live in such a way that nothing had any meaning is still going to be somewhat imposed on you from somewhere,
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
The trial, I mean, not to jump ahead, and we can obviously go back to this, but yeah, the trial absolutely becomes an attack on the person. It's kind of everyone's reaction to his indifference, and almost believing that how is he capable of doing that, and just painting him as this monster character over and over and over again by his lack of seeming empathy. I do want to read something. I'm going to take over. Will tries to read a passage from Jensen.
Will these out right out.
But so this was after he chatted with the magistrate, and this actually I found a hilarious line. It was great. So he said, I won't read the whole bit, but I'll skip down to it. He said, everything was so natural, so well handled, and so calmly acted out that I had the ridiculous impression of being one of the family. And I can say that at the end of the 11 months that this investigation lasted, I was almost surprised that I had ever enjoyed anything other than those rare moments when the judge would lead me to the door of his office, slap me on the shoulder, and say to me cordially, "That's all for today, Monsieur Antichrist." I would then be handed back over to the police. It is so...
Well, I love that you brought that up, because I underlined that. Well, I didn't literally underline it because I don't like to mark my books. For some reason, I don't even like to dog-ear my pages. But I wrote it down in my notebook, which is my version of underlining, Monsieur Antichrist. And that struck me in one way because it's funny. They were clearly kind of poking fun at his sociopathy, or, seeming sociopathy. But then I really just started to think about the concept of the Antichrist. And I kind of read the rest of the part 2 with that in mind. And it reminded me and this isn't like a biblical quote or really anything theological. It's more of like a funny aside that I heard someone say once in passing, that the fundamental lesson of the gospel is that if you tell people the truth, they'll kill you. And in a way, like, Merusault is the foil of that. Like, he's the anti-Christ in that way. Like, he's telling people the truth and telling himself the truth as he sees it. And ultimately, we'll get to that, but I thought that was such a funny kind of parallel with what was happening just narratively with the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, going back even just a couple paragraphs before that, when, he was asking him, if he believed in God, Merusault says, I said no. He said it was impossible. All men believed in God, even those who turned their backs on him. This was his belief, and if he were ever to doubt it, his life would become meaningless. Do you want my life to be meaningless? He shouted. Essentially just turning that back on him is like, do you see what you're doing to me? Like, this reflection of yourself is just very interesting. That whole kind of passage and scene really was excellently written. But really, to me, I think painted the picture of kind of the problem at whole, or really just the situation at whole.
I noticed a lot more in this part two and part also. The symbol of light keeps coming up. It's even more pronounced throughout this part, and I think again kind of underscores that Camus is trying to do something very particular with that image. We talked about on the last episode that light may represent kind of the truth, which we kind of came around to as the truth of the uncaring nature of the universe in a way. The almost, it's not even uncaring. It's actually something more like antipathy. Like it doesn't even know you exist. Like, for something to not care about you, it has to know that you exist at all, and this is almost just like a complete coldness towards, an indifference would be a better word for it. The total indifference for the lives of people that's what Merusault seems to believe, and he pretty much explicitly says that at later parts of this section. And I noticed, like, really early page, I wrote it down, page 73. He's being visited in prison by Marie, and again, there's the image of the harsh light coming in through the window, and there's always this image. It's like ever present throughout his trial. Even in it, like Jensen already mentioned, it goes back as far as the initial scenes in the funeral home of this oppressive light. Did you guys, I mean, obviously you noticed it, but I don't know, did it give a little bit of extra dimension to it, having read this section?
I don't know if I have the words really to dive in or like get philosophical or wax poetic about the symbolism, but given that, we already discussed in part one, like talking about light representing that oppressive indifference of the universe that is always just weighing down on you. I feel like there are scenes, like particularly in his cell, whenever he only has a small window and that light peeks through, and I think at that smaller scale, like just getting that tiny glimpse of that light is bearable and is not, and it feels different for Merusault in those situations than it did on the beach or in other situations.
Like, it almost switches from being oppressive to being almost enlightening.
Yeah, to a degree.
Yeah, like, in our kind of cultural zeitgeist as, being in Western civilization and the beginning of the first 25 years of the 21st century, we kind of have this cultural understanding of light being this symbol of goodness and hope and truth, and for Merusault, that goodness and hope don't exist in this light, and it is just pure unbearable truth.
Mm-hmm.
And having I think it is interesting seeing him confined to a small prison cell and only having a small window where he can see just a sliver of light from the sky. And when the sun rises, especially near the end, I don't want to give anything away yet, but near the end where once morning has passed and the sun is high in the sky, he can finally rest easy with that light cutting through whenever it's highest in the sky.
I was just going to name that same fact that the light was important in key moments in his cell. I was going to basically say that same thing, Jensen, that I noticed that when you think about the symbolism, that became very apparent as he sat in his cell and, going back and forth from the courthouse.
Well, that's very interesting, right? Because that shows a shift kind of in his character arc, if you even want to call it that, where the truth of the universe goes from being something oppressive and daunting to being something darkly comforting.
Given the fact that he's on trial for murder, maybe that makes sense.
It might, and we will shed some more light on this as we continue into the end of this, because I do think that image really helps explain where he ends up philosophically in the very last pages.
Mm-hmm. I want to cut back to something that I don't know if there's anything in it, but it was just kind of an interesting thing. Whenever he is bored in his cell, and the way that he begins to fill his time is just trying to remember his, burping. I'm over here drinking club soda and burping. Sorry. As he is in his cell trying to pass the time, he starts to remember his old apartment. And at the beginning, it takes him 15 minutes to kind of remember everything in it. And then he does it over and over and over again to where he can get lost for hours remembering every minute detail of the apartment, all the way down to, a stain on the wall or even the smell of the room. I don't know. It was interesting.
I think this is the first instance of something that I picked up on only this time reading it, and I did not pick up on the first time, is in the first part, the intrusion of the absurdity of the universe seems to be almost the involuntary thing that is happening to him philosophically. That's what's being imposed in a way. In the second part, I start to see something completely different start to be imposed on him, which is something like meaning. And we see it at first in this section where he starts to clearly value something about the previous life that he had. He mentions a couple of the other times where he was happy, and he uses that word, which is interesting because for someone who doesn't believe that the universe has any inherent meaning, and Camus may actually argue the exact same thing, which I think he is doing throughout this novel, meaning starts to intrude in a way. It's kind of subliminal, and it is involuntary. And I find that really interesting, and it happens a little bit later, without spoiling as we kind of get on into the story. Towards his last moments on screen or on the pages, he starts kind of longing for Marie again, and he mentions something really interesting that he mentions in part 1 as well, where there was this little throwaway line that I underlined because I thought it was just kind of very human, in that he says that I think they were swimming, and he says that she smiled in such a way that I loved her, or something to that effect. He says almost the same thing again towards the end, where he says that he thought of Marie's smile in a particular context, and like that sort of involuntary meaning is really interesting in this part of the book. And he doesn't even seem to be particularly aware of it. Like, he doesn't synthesize that idea and come to some grand realization, as far as I'm aware. But I wonder if that isn't Camus' way of saying, within the context of his whole absurdism, and kind of going and looking ahead to the myth of Sisyphus, where he synthesizes this idea a little bit more fully, is there may not be this inherent, novelesque literary meaning to each and every one of our decisions, and this kind of greater imposed meaning. This is Camus talking, not me. But individual meaning, or something like that, does exist and will intrude in one way or another. I found that kind of interesting, and I wonder how intentional that was.
For sure. I just remembered another thing, kind of around the time whenever he's remembering his room. I don't think it means anything, but it was funny.
I don't think it means anything.
Yeah. But the guard is coming through, and Merusault says that he wished that he could have a cigarette. And the guard says that they're not allowed. And Merusault's kind of a little bummed, and the guard goes, "Well, otherwise being in jail wouldn't be a punishment."
Right. And he underscores that again by saying that usually what people in here miss the most at first is women. And again, we can't allow you that consolation because then this wouldn't be a punishment.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because that almost doesn't occur to Merusault until it's put in those terms, that having been robbed of freedom actually is a punishment, which should be a little concerning to someone like Merusault, because that means that there's at least a values hierarchy of, situations that are preferable to others. And that's the beginnings of meaning making, is value, in something, which I find very interesting. And again, I don't know if it's hard to believe for me that Camus does anything unintentionally.
For sure.
He was so well thought out. I think he's doing that on purpose.
Yeah. And I think that we see fruits of that. They're strange fruit, but there are fruits of that at the end. And I know we're going to talk a lot about that. So, Will, do you have something, or do you want to move on to the trial?
Well, I just want to ask your opinion on this Czechoslovakian story. You mentioned how everything Camus is generally intentional. First off, that story is horrifying.
Yeah.
A son comes home after doing well for himself to his mother's inn, flashes coin, and then is murdered by both his mother and sister, who don't know who he is, yeah. And then later find out and kill themselves, and they dump his body in the river. I just am curious if I thought it was interesting that he spelled that story out.
Yes. Okay, so I thought a lot about this because, first off, if I'm remembering correctly, the story comes to us because part of Merusault's bedding is made out of newspaper, and he starts kind of reading these, scraps of newspaper, and one of the headlines, I guess, in there was this story of the that comes from Czechoslovakia. And just as a quick recap of what happens is Will kind of gave the broad overview, but a son hasn't seen his family in a long time. He's left home, he's married, he's had a couple of kids, I think it says, and he thinks as kind of like a practical joke, he's become successful in life. He's going to come back to his mother's inn and rent a room under a false pretense, under an assumed name, and then surprise his family that I'm back and I've made something of myself. Isn't this fun? Kind of a thing. Obviously, they don't recognize him. And because he's kind of making a show of his wealth, essentially, his mother and sister kill him in his room in order to rob him. And then they find out that it was their son. And it's this, and then the mother and the sister commit suicide after they find out. I think the sister jumps in a well and maybe the mother hangs herself or something like that. This is a really interesting section because it's presented, and then Merusault makes one comment, and then it's never really mentioned again. And the comment that he makes was that the man that was murdered got what was coming to him because, quote, you should never play games. Right? So this is back to Merusault's fundamental idea through Camus' foreword that I mentioned earlier, that he refuses to lie. He believes that, in a way, like lying, misrepresenting yourself, misrepresenting the truth of what you believe, saying more than is true, is almost like an unforgivable sin, in a way, to him, which I think illuminates quite a lot about, just in that little passage, it illuminates a ton of what Merusault thinks about the world,
So is the kind of thought there that when you lie, not only do you hurt yourself, but that others end up being hurt as well, because the mother and sister end up killing themselves as almost a reaction to his lie, in turn?
Yeah, maybe. I think I mentioned this. I mean, it's kind of hard to like draw a nice straight philosophical path to what he's saying, but it reminds me a little bit of like the hyper Kantian idea that if you Kant, and I've mentioned this before, and this is a kind of a very remedial understanding of Kant. I've read like a little bit and had to write an essay for school, and I'm cribbing off of what I remember from that. Kant's kind of whole idea is that you should never act in a way that you wouldn't want to be the universal standard of action. So you could think about that as like the golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And Kant almost kind of tried to secularize that idea as like, don't behave in ways that you don't want every single other person to behave under the exact same circumstances. And so when you get into like kind of Kantian argument, you get into this whole, like, I think Kant even had a section in, if I'm remembering correctly, the book Groundwork for Metaphysics and Morals or something like that. That the chapter header, if I remember correctly, is on a supposed right to lie. So he doesn't, Kant, like under his straight-laced philosophy, you can't lie ever. And so people have gotten into these really funny arguments of like, well, what happens, if you're in the Holocaust and you're hiding Jews in the attic? If you've got Anne Frank in the attic and the Nazis come knocking and they say, are you harboring enemies of the state? How do you handle that, Kantian? And that's a really tough quandary, right? Because then you have to determine like, well, is it okay to lie? Is there a way for me to lie without lying? Is there, like, could you just take issue with their definition of enemy of the state and say, no, I'm not harboring enemies of the state because you believe that, the Jews aren't a enemy of the state. So is that a way around actually lying? Like, you get into all this, like, kind of interesting back and forth on like how one can actually live at the fullest level when you start getting into like ethical philosophies. And that's kind of what it hit me as, in a way, is like Camus gives us the idea of absurdism, and almost through merusault we're seeing the exact perfect version. Perfect, that's not a value judgment, that's just he's doing it exactly as one might if you actually believed these things to their fullest extent. And so for him, yeah, if you lie to your mom and your sister and you flash your money, you kind of deserved what you had coming to you, and that's the way of the world.
That's a very astute description of that. And I found that section, it passed by so quickly. It was like 2 paragraphs, but I was like, I feel like there's a lot more to unpack there. So, but I agree. Yeah.
I mean, people. I did a little bit of like scholarly research on this book, a very limited amount, because I've mentioned before, like I'm finishing a degree right now, and so I still have access to the database for like all of the scholarly articles that we can look up through the school. So I did a little bit of cursory research, and like I'm sure that we're not going to scratch the surface of what's going on philosophically. People have been picking this book apart for the better part of a century at this point, like 80 years. And the no pun intended, the jury is very much out on some of this stuff. It's like, there's so much going on. And I mean, Camus is very enigmatic and difficult to pin down in certain ways, and very just the depth of his writing is going to be mined for, I'm sure, the next century, if not into infinity.
Yeah, no doubt. Do we want to move into the trial? I know.
Yeah, let's just go ahead and jump into that. Yeah. And a lot of these themes are going to continue to emerge. But yeah, let's go with the narrative and go ahead and get into the trial.
So Jensen, do you want to set the scene?
No.
Well, I'll set the scene with again one of these ever-present symbols. I've got it in my edition, page 82. The trial begins with the sun glaring once again. So at all these pivotal moments, that symbol reemerges, which I found very interesting.
So I guess to kind of dive back in, I started at it at the top of the episode to kind of give some recap. There's a lot a lot to be said about once merusault gets into the courtroom, and like he kind of is setting the scene, and I think he points out a lot of things there. But to kind of skip a little bit ahead of that, and also skipping back to what I said at the top of the episode, talking about him being at his mother's wake, there is this string of essentially character witnesses that get brought up time and time again. And I remember my first time reading it, like I really had those feelings like I was talking about at the top of the episode, like, can't a man be in shock? Can't a man have coffee whenever he's tired? Can't a man accidentally doze off whenever he's asleep?
Can't a man grieve in a different way?
Yeah, and also I think I wrote down like whenever, because I was kind of thinking through all these things, like, do you expect a man to stop living because his mother has passed, or is he allowed to like continue to live? And there's all these different things that are these like scathing indictments according to the prosecutor. And I remember reading in especially the first time I read this book, thinking this is a weak defense. Like these are unrelated. Reading it again, I still had some of those thoughts, like I'd said at the beginning. In isolation, none of these things are, in my opinion, bad or like condemnable actions. But what the prosecutor is doing is painting this picture of a person, and in reality, I mean, I would even go as far as to say that I think that Merusault is a sociopath.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the prosecutor is trying to paint the picture of premeditation for the murder, right?
Yeah.
Right. Which there's something interesting also about that, which I will get to. I want to talk about Camus' stance on the death penalty.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I think that's really important, especially because
sure.
the prosecutor's entire case is built around this sense of, he's a psychopath or sociopath. What is sociopath is the one where it's like I always mess this up.
I think both lack empathy,
right?
Fundamentally,
okay.
I think, but I don't really know the difference, honestly.
Yeah. But painting this picture that all these items are just, for Merusault, this is just painting him as someone who had this all, part of the plan essentially, which I think is really important.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Jensen, in isolation, none of these actions are condemnable. But in totality, they do paint a picture of someone who is capable of what he's being accused of, which I think is kind of part of Camus' point, is that technically it's not related, really. Like, none of these other poor behaviors or bad socialization or whatever are evidence of crimes or crimes in and of themselves. But the kind of person that would live this way could only be understood by society as being a stranger, as being outside of whatever it is that we're all doing together as a society, But it's really, really hard to empathize with them at the same time. Mm-hmm. Because, we have, as the reader, we have a completely different perspective than the characters in the novel do. Because we get Merusault's kind of inner commentary often. We get inside his head as he's committing the actual murder. We hear his rationalizations at different parts in the story for why he behaves the way he behaves. And it starts to make something like coherent sense, but nothing like anything that we can really relate to. I don't really know what to do with that. Like, he's genuinely, for me, one of the most difficult characters in literature to empathize with. I start to empathize with him a bit more towards the end because of my particular interpretation of what is happening, but his whole life up until this point is indistinguishable from complete nihilism, right?
Yeah.
And so my initial read, the first time that I read the book, was, and I'll give you a little bit of background context to how I was reading the book the first time. Someone had said to me, I don't remember who or when, that, oh yeah, you have to read The Stranger. It's a seething indictment of the justice system and how it arbitrarily condemns people for unrelated activity and all this kind of stuff. And so I was like, okay, interesting. And I had no other context. So I read the novel expecting to be convinced of that point. And I came away at the end going, no, this is an indictment of nihilism. And this was before I knew anything about Camus' overarching philosophy at all. I hadn't read any of the additional commentary. And, I had read some of his other novels, but The Fall and The Plague, I don't feel deal with the same condition that Merusault is in. Those novels to me are almost from a different period of Camus' philosophical project. And so I didn't have any context for absurdism or what it was that he might be trying to say. So to me, it just read as like, oh, this is this is just Bazarov from Fathers and Sons by Turgenev. Like, this is, that's like the first novel that really popularizes the term nihilism. I think the word had been used before, but it hadn't been used in this kind of a context. And so, for a little bit of information about that book is there's basically a university student named Bazarov who has gotten kind of entranced with this new idea that life has no meaning. And he kind of sets out to impose this on other people in a way, or convince them of this point. And Turgenev takes this in a completely different direction. And I don't want to talk too much more about it because I definitely intend to read that with y'all and talk about it. So I'm just trying to give a little bit of additional context for why I was thinking the way that I was thinking the first time I read it, The Stranger. And it still remains to me upon this additional read through that one could easily just read this book as being a complete indictment of living nihilistically. Because absurdism taken to this extreme is basically indistinguishable from it. And that's kind of that's interesting because I don't think Camus uses this novel to paint us a broad, like I kind of mentioned in the last episode, this isn't prescriptive in the way that the myth of Sisyphus is later, where he offers us something positive that we can do in light of the truth of absurdism in his perspective.
We actually talked about this a bit in the in a previous episode. I don't remember which one it was, but I personally found a lot of comfort in the philosophical framework of Camus' absurdism. And when you read this book and you kind of live in Merusault's shoes, I read this book and say, that's not it. That's not like living inside of that framework. And I think probably just having lived a bit longer and read more things and actually had more time to like think about how I view the world, gave me a lot more perspective. Where like, in the first time I read this, like, I think I had zero context. And so, I read it and I remember not thinking that this was an indictment of the justice system, which I think is a ridiculous thing to say about this book. But it did feel a bit Kafka-esque in the sense that like, this guy is on trial for murder, and our evidence that he is guilty is that he had sex with a girl the day after he buried his mother. And, which I think is,
aside from the fact that he shot a guy in cold blood 5 times. But,
yeah. Never mind. That's already that's handled. But like the reason why he's guilty is it was a bit wild to me. But like, it does paint a picture of the kind of man that he is, and. Do y'all want to keep talking about the trial, or can I?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the trial. Just there's a couple other little things that stuck out to me about that section, particularly when I believe Raymond was being the character witness, and Raymond, like we mentioned previously, was the man that Merusault kind of went to bat for after he had beaten up his mistress, which kind of leads to the culminating incident on the beach. And he, in Merusault, kind of acts as a character witness to Raymond previously, and backs up his story. And that's later used as evidence that Merusault is whatever he is, guilty. In one instance, this kind of goes back to what Jensen said, is can't a man defend his friend without having all the evidence, you could make that argument. In Meursault's case, he tells us that he just kind of went along with what was happening. There was almost no will on his part. Even him becoming friends with Raymond in the first place was kind of an act of indifference, right? He just gets in, he doesn't have dinner or whatever and gets invited and he's like, whatever, I guess I'll hang out with this guy. And that's how he even becomes friends with this guy in the first place, which leads to his eventual, prison sentence and trial. It's all an act of indifference. And Raymond says, when he's kind of pressed by prosecutors about, all of these, what seemed to us, what seemed to them, to the characters, as these coincidences. Well, yeah, the Arabs, they just happen to be the sibling of the girl I beat up, and yeah, we just happened upon them on the beach. That was how it happened. And which is true. They just happened upon them, and then Meursault goes back to the house, and then he just happens to have a gun, right? Because Raymond hands him a gun for almost no reason. He kind of says in that part of the story that it's almost implied that he gives Meursault the gun because he doesn't want to escalate this fight any further than it already has been escalated. He's going to fight. Oh, we're just going to go mano-y-mano and hit each other, and that's going to be that, So he hands Meursault the gun almost like, hey, cover me in case it gets out of hand, but until then, we're just going to fight. It's true that he just happens to have a gun. And then when he goes back out for a walk, it just so happens that he happens upon the Arab again and finds him in a vulnerable situation. And then as we find out, all of these things are coincidences in a way to the characters. But the prosecutor is like, how is that possible? That none of this is premeditated. Like, how is it possible that all of this is, on page 95, quote, just by chance? And that's what, like Raymond said, it was just by chance. That's how all of this happened. It was just by chance. And the prosecutors, who kind of represent broader society, are like, no, it's not. There can't be that many coincidences. Like, but we know in life there can be. And in a certain sense, for Meursault, a lot of these things are totally happenstance. And then we get to, as he's pressed about the murder, why did you do it? Oh, you intended to go back on that beach and find him and kill him, didn't you? No, it was just by chance. And why did you pull the trigger? And what does he say? Because the sun was
because
in my
of the
eyes.
sun. Yeah.
And everyone starts cracking
And everyone
up.
laughs.
Yeah.
But that's true, right? Technically, because that's what the very end of part 1 tells us, is that the sun was in my eyes. And he says, almost involuntarily, I squeezed the trigger. Almost involuntarily, I think, was the exact verbiage that he used. And then after it was done, he was like, then I shot him 4 more times, and it was like knocking 4 times on the, what did he say? On the
door of unhappiness.
Of unhappiness, Yeah.
He
He has no real will in any of this in a way. And I think that's a really important point, that if one does live as if there's no overarching meaning to the universe, what free will do you really have? Like, you just float along with the current, and that kind of seems like part of what Camus is getting at least with that, I think. But again, there's so many articles on this. I could be completely misrepresenting what his intentions were with that, but that's just kind of how it impresses upon me,
If you think we're dead wrong, put it in the comments.
Please educate me.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I've said this before, but I think this is the project of the podcast, and should be the project of the book clubs that you start with your friends. Is you're going to pick up texts like this that are, in my case, over my head. I'm lacking a ton of the cultural context and philosophical context to really get at the meat of it. And I think all of us would agree that we're in that boat. But yet, reading it, doing the best that we can with it, with the tools that we have, and then talking about it is still an edifying experience, regardless of if we manage to come away with the exact thing that the author intends. You know, it's still good for you, and it's still fun to just see what you can make of this stuff. See how it makes you feel, even, is better than nothing, you know?
For sure. Before we move on to the end of the trial and onwards, Will, what are your kind of remaining thoughts about the trial itself?
I mean, not so much that hasn't already been discussed, just more so that, like, I mean, Merusault essentially was just true to himself throughout the entire situation, and it seemed like everything that was packaged about him was someone else's reflection of him. You know, it was their you know, to Taylor's point, impression of meaning or belief onto what he was doing. Even to the point, almost truly hilariously, when he mentions that it was the son that made him pull the trigger. You know, he's trying to act in as truthful a way as he can, and yet to everyone else, it just seems, you know, absurd. Like, it's just, this makes no sense. But which is so crucial to, I guess, the gist and the cornerstone belief of this is, like, you know, this is the way he saw the world, and this is not the way that the rest of the world saw him, and trying to kind of make peace with that kind of counter belief, I think, was really challenging in the trial. To me, he felt so helpless because he kept seeing, like, everything he was saying was just digging himself a little bit deeper, when he was just trying to tell his story. Not to say that, you know, he should have pulled the trigger, you know, and then shot a lifeless body four more times after that. But, you know, there is still, you know, something to say about his total belief in himself, I guess, and what he believes in. So
Taylor had his book out. Either he's about to read out loud or he's got something to say.
No, I was just looking ahead at one of my notes. I think it's important too that during this trial there's several times where he could defend himself and he doesn't. I don't know if that is meant to kind of represent his just general lack of will.
Well, also his lawyer tells
he's just
him
going
not
to go
talk.
along, right? But there, I think he is like put to the question a couple of times and responds in like one word answers, yes, no, whatever, and like again, he's just letting the universe kind of happen to him, and it's not even because he has particular faith in his defense, like. He almost has no like self-defense mechanism at all. Like he doesn't seem to care at all what happens to him, which I think is part of the helplessness that Will brought up. I really want to get to what I thought was probably the most difficult part to understand, and, you know, potentially the darkest section. And so to get us there, the trial culminates in the defense using all of this evidence, quote unquote, of his premeditation by establishing that he's an unfeeling, uncaring pariah of society. He is exactly the kind of person who would premeditate a cold-blooded murder, and the jury agrees. And he is determined by society that he cannot, like, he needs to be made an example of in a public way, and he is sentenced to the guillotine, then sent back to jail to await his impending execution, with one caveat that his defense attorney seems fairly confident that they could get an appeal and win an appeal. So that's kind of where we're left. And then we're thrust back into prison where he continues his ongoing existential project. Let's just go ahead and pick it up from there, guys. What have you got?
There is a particular part. It's the very end. It is the climax of the book. And perhaps there's things that you guys want to get to, but like I have been itching to get to this the entire time.
Oh, if you're going to jump all the way ahead, let's let Will talk about Camus' view of the death penalty, because that actually comes first.
All right.
And I think that'll actually illuminate a little bit more towards the end.
Yeah, that's why
Will mentioned that. Yeah.
I was drawing that out to give opportunity for you to interrupt me, because like I have wanted to talk to you guys so bad about the ending of this book. So like let's
let's preempt that a little bit with this little section. Go ahead, Will.
So from what I was reading in Reflections of the Guillotine by Albert Camus, he talks basically about how the death penalty is almost like an ineffective, almost worse state, kind of what I have here in my notes is like premeditated act of state revenge that degraded society.
Okay.
And he believed it to be really cruel. Basically that the death penalty was not just justice, but like revenge that perpetuated a cycle of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really interesting, since, you know, he talks specifically about premeditation in this book directly. Mm-hmm. And then also in his reflections on the guillotine mentions how the state sanctioned is premeditation. Death penalty is premeditation in its own format as well, because it's kind of inflicting that, this moral suffering, on the criminal. Very, very, just a footnote when I was doing some research and saw that, and I was like, well, this seems very, very relevant to what we're reading here. Taylor, do you have any more insight on that, or have you done any additional like research or reading around that?
Just a little bit. I want to go back to page 110 in my edition. This is where Merusault remembers. I'll just go ahead and read it. He says, "At times like this, I remembered a story Maman used to tell me about my father. I never knew him. Maybe the only thing I did know about the man was the story Maman would tell me back then. He'd gone to watch a murderer be executed. Just the thought of going had made him sick to his stomach, but he went anyway. And when he came back, he spent half the morning throwing up. I remember feeling a little disgusted by him at the time, but now I understood it was perfectly normal. How had I not seen that there was nothing more important than an execution, and that when you come right down to it, it was the only thing a man could truly be interested in?" So, what's interesting about that passage, and don't quote me on this because I might have some of the details mixed up. If I remember correctly, I think that Camus not only ruminates on the death penalty in the essay that you mentioned, Reflections on the Guillotine, but I think it may come up again in The Myth of Sisyphus, or maybe in the introduction to the edition of The Myth of Sisyphus that I have, and I read it in there, and so I think it's part of that book when it's not. It's probably that. It's probably somewhere in that introduction. This little bit there, from what I can remember, is pretty autobiographical. Camus' distaste for the death penalty comes from having heard his father's memory of having seen one. I seem to remember that Camus saw one as a child too, but I don't know if that's true, so don't quote me on that. That's a vague recollection of something that I may have completely mixed up with something else. But more or less, that little tidbit is a little bit of autobiography. Now, I don't know if Camus would have the exact same takeaway as Merusault has, that an execution is the only thing that a man could possibly be interested in. But there is something interesting going on with that passage, particularly as it pertains to what Merusault reflects on as he's awaiting his execution, which is kind of what you mentioned, Will. It's the moral suffering that is inflicted upon the condemned. I don't really know what to do with that, but I just thought I would add that from some additional flavor.
That's super interesting. There was another line which I think is also kind of important, and when I was reading, it was just talking about how, reading my notes here, Camus states that, like, in an unbelieving world without divine judgment, he argued that the state's act of executing someone denied the possibility of atonement, which religious civilizations once allowed for. So it didn't even allow someone to atone for their sins, like talking about the moral quandary there of killing someone and not even giving someone their chance to.
Yeah, and let's think about this too in the context of the story, the actual geographical context of the story. The vast majority of this book takes place in Algiers, which is the capital of Algeria, which at this point was part of the of colonial France. It was a colony of France. They actually didn't have a revolution until I think 1962 or something like that. It was very recent in living memory that Algeria had a very violent and fraught revolution that you can research on your own and learn some about. And there were war crimes and atrocities on both sides, and it was horrific. But at the time, this is a colony of France, and this is France in the early 1900s. So we're now 100 and I don't know, let's say 120 years or so removed from the French Revolution, which was characterized in a lot of ways by the upheaval of a previously religious society in certain ways. I believe that the Jacobins, when they took over Notre Dame, one of the most famous cathedrals in the world, I think that they renamed it something like I don't remember if it was like the Temple of Enlightenment or something like this. But famously, I think one of the revolutionaries said that, basically France can't be free until the last priest is strangled with the entrails of the last king. So a lot of the revolutionary ideal was to uproot the monarchy, for one thing, but also the monarchy was kind of, in a way, buttressed by the religious society. So I think it's interesting that Camus makes that connection between the lack of atonement in a secular society. Not to say that all religious societies banned the death penalty, which obviously isn't true, but there is an interesting kind of philosophical thing happening there, that at least in the previous version of society, there was hope of atonement. And this carries over into the scenes where Merusault is visited by a priest. You almost have this clash of the secular and the religious societies coming together in these scenes, where even though they are living in a post-religious, I think in this context, a post-Catholic kind of society, there's still like the vestiges of religion out there. We might even think about that. We might even think about the priest not just representing religion in a literal sense, but also in just he could represent transcendent meaning at all. Any sort of outside of one's self type of meaning. And he does offer him atonement. He offers merusault the opportunity to, in the traditional religious sense, confess his sins and be saved. But that it could also just kind of represent merusault rejecting the idea of any other type of meaning that could be imposed from something else, So I find all of that very interesting with that line that you brought up, Will. Atonement definitely makes an appearance towards the end of this. Merusault fully rejects it violently. And that part, I think, is still sticking with me. I only just finished reading this an hour ago, so I'm still kind of trying to process what I'm thinking about it, but I want to get a little into that, guys. Go for it.
Here we go. Oh my God. This section wrecked me. Just like before we dive in, like on the content, I finished the book and I sat in my bedroom for like 10 minutes and stared at the wall. And then I had to like go into the living room and like give my wife a hug. And I was like, I'm sad.
Yeah.
But like I wrote in my notes, it's funny, like you kind of mentioned something along these lines is like, I wrote like right after I finished reading, it feels like he begins to wrestle with meaning and falters. You see this as like, throughout kind of leading up as he's rejecting the chaplain, and through kind of his like as he's thinking to himself, and then as the priest comes in and he sits down, and they start talking. I think we see this play out. Will, go ahead. You don't have anything?
No. You got it. I'm locked in. This is your stage.
So like this idea of like being confronted with meaning, and just like I'm just kind of flipping through my notes, and I say I see a prideful man faced with imminent death and just revolting against what the priest is offering and against what is like pressing down upon him. And he, it's like he clenches his fists and it just cries out, "It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Whether I'm executed tomorrow or I live for another 20 years, it doesn't matter." And this is like, we've talked about, and I've mentioned already earlier in the episode, like I feel an affinity towards kind of Camus' philosophy, and then we see it play out this way. And this guy just giving up on any hope or having any, like, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering, but like, it's funny. I'm actually looking at my notes, and I'm not going to show it. My handwriting's terrible, but like in like 3 different places I have in all caps, like with quotes around it, "It doesn't matter." Hold on. It like, I'm telling you, I got like up by this, because like, yeah, it doesn't matter to you, and like maybe it doesn't matter to the universe, but like my life matters to me.
Yeah.
100%.
Heck yeah. No, it's almost like he's trying to convince himself at the end.
Yeah.
Right.
And I mentioned this earlier, that there's these small moments where meaning intrudes it uninvited. And he remembers the smile on Marie's face, and he remembers his apartment, and he remembers his freedom, he remembers his happy day on the beach, and how, is there still a chance that I could get out of this and go swimming again? And it's like, meaning is going to find your ass, whether you want it or not sometimes. And like, I think that's what I took away from a lot of this ending was like, you can think that you're staring down the universe. You're gonna stare into that abyss and it's gonna flinch before you do. But like, as the end starts coming, some things are gonna bubble up to the surface, and the weight of meaning is going to find you. That's kind of what it felt like to me. And I don't even know if that was Camus' intention there, but maybe it's just my own socialization and the way that I think. But that's how it hit me, was like, what do you mean it doesn't matter? Of course it matters.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Like, it's the only thing that matters, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's funny. This book is known for its opening line, but its closing line was bone chilling. There's gonna be so many like duck quacks in this episode. I feel like I was pretty good most of the episode, but just like the entire like last like
I feel like I
30
need to
minutes.
introduce a new sound effect or something. There's gonna be duck quacks for 40% of this.
Yeah. What does he say? Where's good? I felt that I had been happy and was again. For everything to be consummated, for me to feel less alone, I had only to wish that there be a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution, and that they greet me with cries of hate.
I didn't even know what to do with that line, other than explain it as like, I think because throughout this podcast, we read The Death of Ivan Ilyich for our first episode. And Ivan has a similar trajectory in that he realizes that his life had no meaning. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't meaning to be found. It was just that he had lived his life in such a way that it was inauthentic and lacked meaning. We talked about how almost every, in a similar way to Merusault, he acted seemingly with no agency. But in Merusault's case, his lack of agency comes from a fundamental belief that no decision that he makes actually matters. And with Ivan Ilyich, his lack of agency was he was directing all of his effort towards a societal expectation of meaning. So it's two different orientations of how one can direct their life. One presupposes that there is meaning. He just happened to choose the wrong target in Ivan's case. In Merusault, there is no meaning, and I'm going to aim at that target, and I'm going to hit it in the bullseye. Mm-hmm. And it was just disconcerting because Ivan, throughout his realizations, he actually has what is a literal religious conversion that is also could be represented as a realization of what a good life could be. But he goes through these stages of a literal religious and spiritual conversion, and it almost feels like that Merusault, almost like I mentioned, in this antichrist way, he does the opposite of a conversion. He gets worse as it goes on. Like he becomes more and more entrenched in this idea until the very end. In the very end, he's in a far darker place than at the beginning. When his realization of the absurd in the beginning of the book is more so acted out in something that looks like hedonism, which is fun in the moment, and there's no repercussions for my actions, and I can just kind of live in whichever way suits my fancy for whatever is presented to me in that moment. What that ends up as is just abject nothingness. It's like a void, you could almost bookend these books together with Ivan Ilyich and The Stranger, because Ivan, at the end, the book says that there was no death, there was light. And as Merusault plays out, the light is fading, and now there's only death. And that's it. That's his realization, is it doesn't matter if I die now or in 20 years when I'm elderly. And it's like, I mean, I guess, but it obviously matters.
Yeah.
The manner in which one lives their life and dies obviously matters to all of us, right? And it just is so difficult to see him as anything other than just a embittered, wasted life,
Yeah. Totally absent of just any sentiment and feeling. And it the way I like kind of read these last few pages, it had this vision of him literally tumbling down a hill. It was just him falling down a hill like that, just this bleakness that there was no slowing it down. He's
Yep.
to not say to not use a rock going down a hill metaphor, but yes, this
right.
rock that was tumbling down a hill that couldn't be stopped.
What's that last moment of him? Because he's annoyed with the priest, and then the priest says, "I'll pray for you," and that's like the moment that I like to believe that the priest says that, and there's that twinge in Merusault's heart, and that twinge in his heart disgusts him, and that is why he flies off the handle and has grabbed the guy by the collar of his cassock and is screaming this tirade, this nihilistic tirade into this priest's face and digging in his heels.
That's what it feels like to me too. It feels like digging in one's heels almost. You know what it felt like to me, and I'm sure that all of you guys can relate to this. Have you guys ever been in an argument with somebody and you're losing, but you have the realization, you're like, "Yep, I am totally off base here, or my logic totally does not work here, but there's no way I'm going to let this person have the satisfaction of beating me in this argument." That could be, something with a spouse, or just arguing about politics with your coworker. You've lost. Like, that's what it felt like to me, was like, he gets these, like I said, these intrusions of what might be meaning, or what one might be able to orient oneself towards in order to live something like a meaningful life. And he is like, "Nope, I lived this way, and I am not going to stop now. I am digging in my heels. I'm going to further entrench myself in this position, and I'm dying on this hill." And that's really bleak. And it's underscored for me too, because in other existentialist literature that we'll read, and that stuff that we've read together, like, if Dostoevsky wrote this novel, Merusault may very well still ultimately be executed, but on his way to the gallows, that sun would shine on him, one last time, and he would repent. That would be Dostoevsky in a way. And, we might see a little glimmer of redemption, but Camus is just like, nah, you're not getting any of that. You're going to get way worse. And and I'm not going to give you any consolation. There's no way out because you're reading Merusault's point of view. This is where he is, and this is exactly where I'm leaving you to with no consolation. So, brilliant ending. Yeah. Extraordinarily hard to digest.
Yeah.
But a perfect ending. Mm. A perfect ending to an odious character who I do not look forward to getting in the head of again.
Yeah. It was, I mean, so I read this whole book and it was 2 sittings. I read part 1 in one sitting and part 2 in the other sitting. And it just takes every single part of your psyche, to dig into. It just envelops you in so many ways. It's really tough. It's a really tough book. It's really tough to explain and talk about, like, to anybody who has zero context into it. It's like it takes a really good sit and read to really.
Yeah, someone asked me at work that they know that I like to read and stuff, and we'll talk about books occasionally. And she was like, "What are you reading right now?" And I was like, "I'm reading The Stranger by Albert Camus. Have you heard of it?" And she was like, "I think I've heard of the title. What's it about?" And I was like, it's about a guy who believes that life has no meaning, and so he lives his entire life as if it has no meaning. And she was like, "Well, that sounds fun." It was not fun. Yeah. It was not fun, dear reader.
Yeah.
I do want to. I think that is a great way to just kind of end the content discussion of this novel. So I'd like to just go ahead and kick it over to you guys to talk about. Let's talk about just a little bit about like what struck you about Camus' artistry, his actual writing. We touched on this a little bit. We could just kind of briefly talk about how you enjoyed the actual act of reading it, like how easy you found it to read, aside from the philosophical implications. I thought it might be nice to just kind of tie it up with more general artistic impressions of the book.
I can kick us off.
Yeah.
I'll just say, I mean, despite the challenging, to your point, difficulty of this book and what you're actually taking from the words, it is very easy to read. The characters are grounded and like you can see them clearly, well described. I mean, every time Marie or was presented on the page, I mean, it was just clear as day to me. And I love that he was able to do this in as short. I mean, 120 pages is pretty short, right, for a novel of this magnitude. Mm-hmm. So I found it to be just very enjoyable to read, and that's why I think also I was able to do it in just 2 sittings. I think I remember texting you guys. I read part 1. I was like, I just want to keep going. Like this is excellent. So again, yeah, just to kind of highlight again the fact that it's an incredibly challenging book philosophically, but is incredibly easy to read in just the way it's presented and the facts that are presented, and it allows you to follow the story and narrative, mm-hmm. and ultimately get into Merusault's head and the way he sees the world in a very clear and direct way, which I think is great for someone who, might read The Stranger for the first time, or Albert Camus might be their first, or The Stranger might be their first, dive into Camus' philosophy. This is an excellent presentation of said philosophy, mm-hmm. for anyone who wants to get into it. So, great book. Enjoyed it.
For sure. I think it definitely shows. I think whenever you look at the absurdism philosophy, there are 2 paths. One of them is the path that Merusault follows, and the other I think is objectively harder because it places so much more responsibility on you. Mm-hmm. For Merusault, he has no responsibility because nothing matters. The alternative path, the universe doesn't care. It is unthinking, unfeeling, and disinterested. And so like it's not going to give you any meaning, and so it is on you. You have to create it and decide what is meaningful. But it is a path that I've said before on this podcast, is that it is a feeling like it's a path that I find incredibly freeing, because I am free from any kind of oppressive like thing kind of pushed onto me. I appreciate the responsibility and the freedom to decide what is meaningful and what matters. And I get to decide, whenever I get to the end of my life, by what measure did I live a good life?
Yeah, and I think as this book tells us too, is that it's a knife that cuts both ways, because while your path, may seem as not taking on any sort of external or oppressive stricture to find meaning, Merusault's path is equally oppressive. Just because you live as if there's no meaning doesn't mean that it won't be imposed in some way. And it also doesn't mean that you will be free from reality, I think is a way to say it. And Merusault, goes down with the ship. But one could make an argument that the way in which he lived out this absurdist idea was just as oppressive as any moral system could be,
Yeah. And
it's just a...
Yeah, and
as the great philosopher Robert Zimmerman once said, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody.
Nice. Yeah, I think that any philosophy, whether it be Kant, I was thinking about this earlier when you were talking about philosophical like moral systems, any kind of moral philosophy that you apply some level of stricture to, where you have to follow this exactly, like could never tell a lie, but you're in Nazi Germany and you're harboring or keeping Jews safe in your attic, and then the Nazi officer comes to your house. Anything followed too strictly, particularly when it comes to like moral systems or philosophical systems, is that they always break down somewhere, and so you have to add some level of flexibility into like any of your philosophical systems to give room for things you hadn't thought of or situations that need some level of flexibility. And the oppressive weight of external meaning isn't necessarily just like a moral thing, but I feel like there's this kind of idea in a lot of that I've seen a lot, especially in I think it's most elementary. That's not a word. In an elementary way, it's shown very simply in Disney movies that your life is written in the stars and everything out is laid before you, and that is more importantly, that is what I reject. I wasn't born to be this or that, and I wasn't born to be married to this person or any of that. Like, I choose. That's for me
maybe Maybe.
One thing I do just want to say, when I was kind of reading on the reflections on the guillotine, one of the things that I read a few times, and again, I didn't write it down, but I feel like I recall this. It's interesting that you both noted the concept of like harboring Jews as like potential like moral, this could be challenging for someone who, do you lie in this situation? Like, what do you do? I read something that Camus actually pulled back a little bit on his belief on the death penalty when we were talking about post-World War II and Nazis. He actually saw that it probably would be better for some Nazis to be executed. Or there were some writings in that was implied. I need to go. I was reading certain places that this was something that had been shared, so I need to I don't want to say that's the truth or that's the matter of fact, but interesting that you state that A, that you both made that specific example, but B, that he also had a little bit of a.
So you're saying he would have suggested that we do execute Howard W. Campbell Jr.
I was going to say, who else thought that Nazis should be executed was our last protagonist from Mother Night. So I think that just sort of underscores what Jensen said, is that with any moral philosophy or any deeply held belief, there is often some play in the joints, and sometimes new information is presented that makes strict adherence to one of those ideals a little bit less realistic. And I think that merusault could have potentially benefited from a little bit of flexibility.
Yeah.
Well, we rate books on a scale of A through F, typically speaking. What do you guys rate The Stranger?
S tier.
S tier.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's true. I should have said that. Just like all the YouTube tier lists, we should have added the S. I don't even know what S stands for.
Superlative.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Perhaps.
I'm not sure.
Because I know A, B, C, D, E, F don't stand for anything. So why would S?
I'll give it an A, but not an A plus, only because it didn't make me feel very positive at the end of the book. So
fair enough. I'll go with Jensen on S tier, and I agree with Will's general assessment that if you are interested in existential philosophy, I think that Camus would have maybe bristled at the term existentialist being applied to him. But if you're interested in the philosophical novel, in a novel that explores the philosophical motivations of a character and gets you inside the head of their motivations, this is a great place to start. It's eminently readable, and there is an absolute plethora to unpack within it. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this two-parter on The Stranger by Albert Camus. And I'll go ahead and announce the next work that we're going to do. So we're going to do something really short now. I want to encourage you to go ahead and go out and, if you don't already have it, pick up a copy of the complete short stories of Ernest Hemingway. If you don't own that book, it is an absolute must-have for anybody that's a fan of literature. A lot of people argue that Hemingway's short stories were his best work. It's difficult to disagree with that. He was a master of that form, although I do love his novels. So, if for whatever reason you don't have a copy of that, and you don't want to commit to getting the full thing, or you can't afford it, or what have you, this story is available on the Internet Archive. I Googled it earlier and found a full version of it. It's like 6 pages. It's very, very short. You can read it in probably, between 15 and 30 minutes, depending on how fast you read. And I would encourage you to go ahead and read it multiple times before we discuss it, because it's that short and there's a lot to unpack in it. The name of the story is A Clean, Well-Lighted Place by Ernest Hemingway. A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. Again, Internet Archive. If you don't want to go ahead and pick up a full short story collection by Ernest Hemingway, but again, I would encourage it just because they are all worth reading. I'm very excited to go through something really short with y'all. I think it'll be a really good one to demonstrate how a master of the form of the short story can pack a lifetime of experience in a very, very, very small amount of pages. Hemingway is one of the best at compacting meaning into very small, terse sentences. So I hope you guys will join us on the next episode of Shelf Destruct for A Clean, Well-Lighted Place by Ernest Hemingway. It's been great talking with y'all tonight. Can't wait to do it again.
Great talking, boys.
See you guys.